You are very welcome to this Blitz question and answer session on Ukraine's very moving, deeply moving, right? Liberation of Kherson and Russia's loss of Kherson. Now, don't think that this is just a great Ukrainian victory. This is also something that advances, and it's not pompous to say it, the security interests of all Western countries. And that's based on the kind of analysis of the war that I've been advancing, not just here, but also on the main channel. First question, how has Russian propaganda reacted to losing Kherson? There's a kind of generic video on the main channel about Russian propaganda, but lots of patterns have developed since that video was made. Here are two of them. Russian propaganda has become episodically dependent on the Kremlin. You might say, what the hell are you talking about? It's the function of this thing to service the interests of the Kremlin. That's what it's for. Yeah, of course it is. But it's typically led an independent life, like a sort of platform that floats alongside the Kremlin, just looks over the shoulder to see what the Kremlin's up to, what it wants, and autonomously constructs its activity, constructs its message. One of the things that's happened more recently is that we have seen some at least indirect evidence of top-down edicts coming in and therefore explicitly politically guiding the propaganda machine. I think we saw this with the Russia's loss of Kherson, because if you looked at the federal channels, Kherson seemed to be out of the top 3 news stories on all of them. That's not a coincidence. In other words, there's a clear political suggestion there. All of you are going to do this with that story. That doesn't typically happen. It's normally an autonomous enterprise, this propaganda machine. And it's very nervous now because it's used to going its own way, making mistakes, and then self-correcting. But now that it's on the receiving end of direct political edicts, it's worried about taking a misstep. And now you're seeing a lot of sort of care, fear, and ambiguity in the way the propagandists conduct themselves. So there is this story of a loss of autonomy and therefore this consequent development of confusion, uncertainty, ambiguity on behalf of the propaganda machine, an attempt to cover all possible bases. So instead of playing offense, to some extent the propaganda machine is now playing defense, anticipating the fact that it could fall foul of the next political edict. So that's one change there, or a couple of changes. Can you comment on Dugin's statement on Kherson, and did Dugin ask for Putin to be taken out? Now, Dugin is a guy we talked about a couple of times here on the main channel, and Dugin tries to follow the steam train by running ahead of it. So there is virtually no world in which Dugin is going to criticize Putin existentially and say this guy shouldn't be in office or this guy should be gotten rid of or something else. Dugin is not likely to do that unless he loses his mind or unless Putin is on the verge, seriously on the verge of losing power. Then Dugin could stop being committed to him. But Dugin for many, many years has thought stably that while Putin is not the kind of serious totalitarian dictatorship that Russia needs, he is overwhelmingly the only good transitional bet for Russia. And that remains Dugin's position. So that means that no, Dugin couldn't have said this, and if we check the facts as far as I can see them, he didn't say it, and a couple of people on different social media platforms have got angry with me for playing this story down, simply because, well, it could be for different reasons, but in some cases I do think that there's this tendency to want Russian intra-elite conflict porn. And sometimes there is some, but sometimes there isn't any, and we've got to be clear about it. There is also the suggestion that Dugin removed the statement in which he supposedly asked for Putin's life to be taken. And he didn't remove it. It's still everywhere. In fact, 5 minutes ago, I got it from Dugin's Telegram. So what does Dugin say here? I'm not going to give it to you literally because there's a literary example there, so I'm just going to give you the rough sense of what he means. I mean, if it's interesting. So he says, giving away Kherson is just a catastrophe. It's a betrayal of the Russian people. Anybody who isn't feeling acute pain now is a non-entity. And then he basically goes on to say that absolute power comes with absolute responsibility. And absolute power only works if, in the last resort, the absolute autocrat, the absolute monarch, is there to save you. If at that last moment isn't going to save you, then the whole thing doesn't work. And if it's that kind of autocrat we're dealing with, then you've got to get rid of him, and the fate that could befall him is indeed the fate of death. However, he then clearly goes on to suggest that that's not Putin's predicament, because Putin's fate is to be decided by what he does. And so this message remains completely consistent with Dugin's support for Putin. And he says the next step that Putin should basically take is to, in a fully fledged way, introduce ideology and change the order of the state. It's the old story of Russia's totalitarian turn, Russia's fascization, that we always say has gone 20-25%. Dugin saying, take it to 100 now. That's what we need. That's what he is appealing to. And then he does say that, look, we can't go on making these concessions in the future. So did Dugin ask for Putin to be taken out? No. Next question. If Russians believe in the referendum results, how do they justify crowds greeting Ukrainian soldiers liberating territories? Does it make it clear to the Russian people how badly the war is going? No, it doesn't. Why not? It makes clear to the Z group, to the ultra-radical group, that the war is going badly. Why? Because they are fighting a war in their head, right? Most of the Russian population are still not clear that this is a war. They think that it's something that is being done by the Kremlin, that you should outsource decisions and oversight over this to the Kremlin. You don't need to think about it much, and we're only going to think about it if mobilization hits us directly. If it doesn't, we're not going to go there. So most Russians are not understanding that this is a war, and a war that's not real can't be going badly. But this is fluid and changing. Does the fact that Russia's failed to take action on its so-called red lines means that they don't exist? No, obviously not. Despite the common narrative that that's true. Let me just say the most important thing to understand here about Russia losing Kherson. This is a defensive war for Putin. This is a defensive war in the eyes of those Z radicals. This is not an optional aggressive war. It's a necessary defensive war. So that must change how you understand this. They can't say, ooh, we optionally got into this offensive gambit. As it's not working, we can, cancel it. Now, there's going to be consequences for the next couple of generations for Russia, but at least we can stop the military operation. Well, no, that's not possible, because this is a defensive existential war. Increasingly, it's a defensive existential war against all of NATO. Now, from our side, it looks like our involvement is just a proxy involvement, according to the Russian propaganda machine, and to what the Kremlin says. This is not even a proxy war. This is something that's closer to a direct war. But nevertheless, this is a defensive and necessary war. And so losing important gains isn't going to put into existential doubt the war itself. Yeah. The second thing I would say is that about red lines specifically, is that there are going to be red lines that are to do with Putin's loss of power, and really with any existential threat to the regime. No such threat exists in the short term. Putin thinks it exists in the medium term, and that Ukraine's very existence exemplifies that threat. But in the short term, he doesn't think that threat exists. Therefore, from the fact that they've done nothing several times in a row, having announced red lines, doesn't follow that we can suspend the nuclear question. In fact, nuclear risk is low now, but it's going to go up, in my opinion, over the next few months. So in other words, the Kherson defeat doesn't prove that nuclear weapons are 100% off the table. How do you assess the prospect of increased Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory? I assess it as an inevitability. And I think that Putin wants that from the Russian side. He wants it because he is now convinced that even if he's not willing or able to turn this into a great patriotic people's war, he wants to take the war closer into that direction, and Ukraine striking Russian territory will allow him to remodel the situation like this. Obviously, he doesn't care if Russian civilians are killed in the process or not. That's irrelevant to him. Are the elites, another elite question, but not about Dugin, are the elites more split since Kherson? Elite splits are still latent in Russia. That's why we've got to take it easy in the propaganda porn. So you can bunch this in different ways. Let's put 3 buckets up briefly. There are folks who wield some power and are radical. You know several of them. You know Prigozhin with his private army. You know Kadyrov. You may know Kovalchuk, Putin's key ideological advisor, so people with money and power in this case. So that's one bunch. Yeah. Then there is the bunch of people who have some power and maybe some influence, some money, but while they in principle support the war in an ideal form, given how badly it's going, they're open to the war being ended. They're not as such anti-war, they're just open to the idea that if this is going to be such a disaster and their own livelihoods are at stake, and the socioeconomic future of Russia is at stake, it could be worth thinking about, trying to stop this thing soonishly. And then there is the third group, and Dugin is in that group. These are people with no political power, no monetary weight either, but they are ultra-radical. So these groups, they aren't groups really, they're just labels that sort of cover some of the divisions that are there. So these 3 will, like tectonic plates, sort of bump against each other more and more as time goes on, but all of this at the moment is latent and isn't ready to in any sort of interesting way bubble over. Lots of love, talk soon.